This video is a summary of all my thoughts on the Lahai-Roi arc of Wuthering Waves, aka 3.0 to 3.3. It contains my opinions on the main story, exploration and side quests, open world exploration, events and other side content, the anniversary, collaborations, combat and gameplay additions, quality of life additions and other features, and finally, bugs. As opposed to 2.x, I've decided to consolidate my thoughts of multiple patches into a single video so that I can redistribute my time more effectively and work with fewer deadlines. I initially wanted to make this video after 3.x is over, but upon seeing that the Lahai-Roi arc is pretty much over in 3.3, I decided to just do a review of these 4 patches. Without further ado, let's start with my thoughts on the main story.
It's a giant worm!
3.0's main story is initially wonderful but gets more disappointing the further one progresses. This applies to both parts. The first half of part 1 was great as it has enough screen time for multiple playable and non-playable characters, with character dialogue carrying the slow-paced sections that take place in Star Torch Academy, and to a lesser extent the Research Institute. I enjoyed the Star Torch section the most as the story builds up its mystery, while Lynae hard carries the section with her interactions with her professors and Sigma. I also liked that the Void Worm was given 2 nice spectacles, a straightforward ranged fight in the desert, and a Halo War Scarab section where the player has to take cover behind destructible cover to survive before attacking the main threat. In terms of characters, I like how Lynae's traits, the fact that she's a terrible liar and the contrast between her serious and bubbly sides representing her past life and her present desire to move away from it, are introduced very early and shown repeatedly in the story, namely when she travels to Hivacious Boss Arena to confront the Frexidus agent, and when she tries and fails to worm her way out of the investigation. On the other hand, I hate the way Chisa was completely pushed aside to make way for Lynae. Her reunion with her parents, which was one of her main goals in 2.8, happened off-screen with the only payoff being an optional dialogue section. The Academy section would have been much stronger if Chisa was involved, but she wasn't even given that. She was also robbed of interactions in side quests, which is kind of puzzling to me since side quests are usually self-contained optional stories that don't really follow the rules or trends that the main quests tend to go by. I even wrote an entire section of my 3.0 video talking about Chisa and the concerning pattern of how the developers treated their characters, especially in 2.x. After the rover burns his or her cassette, the story's pacing dramatically accelerates till the end, with only one small break in Lynae's dorm room. Lynae's fake expulsion is by far the worst part of this chapter as it has no consequence at all and doesn't even change how she normally acts or how many rules she breaks in future chapters. Additionally, it's strange how no one else was there for the Void Worm fight even though the story takes place in an academy of resonators. It's as if they were completely unprepared even though Void Storms and Void Worm attacks were expected by those living in Lahai-Roi. Additionally, I'm not a fan of the fact that the rover quickly becomes a celebrity right after arriving in Star Torch Academy, especially after 1.x and 2.x where he or she is also put on such a pedestal. For a while, I had hoped for a less ridiculous portrayal of how other characters treated the rover, but I guess I'll have to accept that even though he or she isn't perfect anymore, which is good, he or she will still be a well-known celebrity wherever he or she goes, which is lame and immersion breaking. Regardless, I'd rate this part as above average, but only because of the earlier sections. Part 2 focuses more on the Roya tribe and the Bjarter Woods, and it does quite a good job exploring both. It also features Mornye, but it doesn't develop her enough, likely because most of her character development happened before the rover arrived in the region. However, she was already established as a logical scientist, so her decision to walk everywhere during the quest doesn't make any sense, especially since her introduction saw her sitting on a floating chair. I also dislike how the writers used their stupid excuse to throw Lynae out of the story, since Lynae could have easily rejoined Mornye and the rover after distracting this tardy unit here. In addition, this chapter takes place right after 3.0 Part 1, which threw Chisa away, and 2.x, which had a main story that was heavily tarnished by forced companion quests. Much like the first half, which had a huge missed opportunity regarding interactions between Lynae and Chisa, the second half also suffers the same issue, but with Lynae and Mornye. Where Part 1 could have had an old versus modern dynamic that explored Star Torch Academy's evolution over the decades, Part 2 could have had the impulsive versus logical dynamic in terms of personality, and explored why Lynae and Mornye are so close. As far as I'm aware, we've only heard of their shared interest in racing through dialogue, but we never see any of it, nor of any other hobbies, which really sucks. Fast forwarding a bit, the Shaper, during his introduction, asks the rover to give him permission to do the thing he needed to, even though there was no indication that the rover was even involved in the construction of the place or the machine that the Shaper needed, and thus shouldn't be able to authorize anything. Much like Part 1, the pacing accelerates towards the end and heavily disrespects the Royan Saboteur, which frustrated me quite a bit. The desperate and calculated villain was turned into a raving lunatic in his last moments, which took me out of the story rather violently. Overall, I'd rate 3.0's main story as average, even though it has a great first impression and premise on both parts. Some things in the story don't make sense, and characters both playable and otherwise were heavily disrespected. For my full thoughts on the story, I highly recommend watching my 3.0 video if you haven't already. Yeah! 3.1's main story is widely praised for its character writing, and when compared to all other main quests, it's one of the better ones, and it also expands on much needed prelim and lore. Although it features Aemeath prominently, it only focuses on her for 2/3 of the story, which is an improvement from 3.0 and especially 2.x regarding character usage. I thoroughly enjoyed the first third, which focuses on lore and sticks to the space exploration theme that Lahai-Roi has, with Luuk and Nevora accompanying the rover through the space station. I particularly enjoyed the anti-gravity platforming section and the boss fight with the Black Ops 1 Zombies astronaut. The boss fight with Sigillum at the end of the chapter is beautifully presented as well and easily rivals Hecate and Fleur-de-Lis in terms of spectacle. However, the fight drags on for quite a while, giving me the impression that it overstays its welcome, but only a little bit. After the space station section is complete, the rover travels to his or her old home with Aemeath, and the story's focus shifts to Aemeath and the rover from there. The entire chapter hinges on their relationship, and if it wasn't a thing, I doubt it would have been as well received. Much like how Lynae was introduced in 3.0, 3.1 immediately makes Aemeath's Johnny Silverhand trope very clear, which immediately makes her interesting. However, in some cases, characters that accompany the rover pause awkwardly to let Aemeath deliver her line, even though only the rover can hear or see her, which makes their interactions less believable. About halfway into the story, it is revealed that she is the rover's foster daughter, which isn't surprising since earlier dialogue obviously hinted at this. Because I've stopped taking the story as seriously as I used to since 3.0, I don't care much about her, even though I recognize that she is quite well written. While playing through this chapter, I found the rover's past, which was also explained in this chapter, to be more interesting. Also, it is liberating to finally have a character reject the rover when he or she wants to invalidate their choices in favor of his or her perfect ending where everyone makes it out alive. Speaking of which, I still view Cardathia surviving 2.2 and Yuno's resurrection in 2.6 as big writing mistakes, especially Yuno. Anyway, having Aemeath be the rover's daughter actually helps to humanize the rover, which has so far been more of an outsider with little personal stakes in the main story. This finally makes the main character more relatable, which is a big improvement compared to 1.x and 2.x. Unfortunately, 3.1's main story also suffers from pacing issues and things that don't make sense. While it is refreshing to have a story not end on an epic fight for once, it does drag on for quite a while after the boss fight with Sigillum. Speaking of which, Sigillum's existence explains the frequency leaks since 2.8 and its behavior before the final fight, but I guess the writers just forgot to also have it hunt down the rover in 3.0. In other words, Sigillum was conveniently absent in 3.0 because the story didn't focus on the rover at the time. Additionally, the tropes that initially made Aemeath interesting were kind of thrown away towards the end. The Johnny Silverhand trope was dropped just so that she can explore the academy and have her obligatory idol performance before she sacrifices herself anyway. After which, a weird husk was left behind that basically spoiled her rescue in 3.3. Finally, let's address LF1, the new Threnodian introduced in 3.0 but fleshed out in this story. I did not take this threat seriously at all, and I think I predicted its downfall quite well. After almost 2 years of the rover easily defeating the bad guys, the writers finally realized in 3.1 that a story needs a serious threat to keep players invested. The sudden jump in power level of Drenodians from 1.x and 2.x to 3.x looked comical and came across as a desperate plea by Kuro to get players to care more about the plot past the flashy visuals. As shown in 3.3, LF1 was quickly defeated by the rover, with Aemeath's help of course, but it wasn't really much of a struggle anyway.
Indeed. And now he's here to us!
The segue to 3.2 features Luuk, who is a former spy who went undercover to investigate the Frexidus, though he isn't affiliated with the Black Shores to my knowledge. This makes him more interesting than most characters and adds to his likability. Not only was he a key character in 3.1's main quest, he was also familiar with the rover in the past as suggested in 3.0. While I do enjoy his relationship with the rover, it's disappointing that the rover told him to take a break at a crucial moment in his investigation. He managed to steal the Grand Architect's pen, which became a catalyst for the latter to reveal himself in the story, which led to him revealing his plan for some stupid reason. I like this story overall, and the only problem I really have with this story is how it did the calm and collected Warren incredibly dirty. While 3.0 initially presented him as a decent professor who happened to be an asshole, and later revealed that he was a Frexidus spy, which reduced my interest in him. Then, this segue turned him into a raving lunatic much like the Roya guy in 3.0 Part 2. Both characters were disrespected in such a massive way that I'm convinced that the writers don't know how else to bring down pawns like them. Plus, they have a track record of disrespecting characters like Lupa and Shisa, and with these new examples, they're disrespecting their minor villains as well. What a shame.
Good morning, Glenn!
3.2's main story is short, simple, and lighthearted, which is a nice transition from 3.1's heavy story. As always, it revolves around the banner character who is Sigrika, aka Sigri Chupi. She's basically the Lahai-Roi version of Phoebe, as she is cute and has an affinity with Soleskins instead of Echoes. The story spends plenty of time in the so-called dark side of Startorch Academy, a sonorosphere that contains the negative emotions of all the students. The theme is simple: expectations. Sigrika's struggle with the expectations of the Roya and the Academy staff and students is at the heart of the story, and of course, it's the rover's job to help her out. This story does its job well enough, as not every character needs to be as complex as, say, Aemeath or Cantarella. The story mostly takes place in the dark side of the Academy. Boring name aside, this sonorosphere is used to explore the fears of several characters like Sigrika, Ayla, Savi, and Lucilla. The setting allows for more freedom in environmental design and camera angles, making these scenes much more interesting as a result. On another note, Sigrika's introduction is very cute and enjoyable, and the holding hands thing was brought back. However, it only lasted a few minutes, so there was no good reason to include it. Also, it is far easier to trigger the teleport failsafe in this quest, which I found to be quite funny. 3.2's main story incorporates many characters and balances them quite well. Sigrika in 3.2 is like Carlotta in 2.0, as in she had just enough screen time to be in focus while the other characters were also given some time to contribute, be it supporting roles like Lucilla or short appearances like Lynae, Denia, and Shisa. I particularly enjoyed the scenes where these characters interact with Sigrika and/or the rover. However, there are two things I find strange. Firstly, Lynae was excluded from an investigation regarding a Frexidus member hidden in the Academy despite her being in a great position to contribute. Secondly, unlike most other main quests, 3.2's main quest requires the player to do an event, which is kind of weird. I'll cover the event under the relevant chapter, but I will point out here that the event seems to be a form of padding. It could have easily been a separate thing that takes place after the main story, but since the main story was probably deemed too short, the developers made the player switch back and forth between the main quest and the event during the main story, which throws off the pacing of the plot on top of forcing the player to do a small part of the event to progress the story, which is annoying for those who tend to do main and side content separately. Personally, I find this tie-in to be frustrating since there were about 2 or 3 times where I was in the middle of the main story and I wanted to see what happened next before doing the event. That's all for now, as I will cover the rest of my thoughts on this event in its corresponding chapter. Finally, I find the gameplay part of this quest to be quite decent with a few big flaws. The highlights for me include the platforming sections and set pieces that take advantage of the sonorosphere environment as well as the final boss fight. And now for the flaws. The player and Sigrika spend most of their time in the dark side together, so it's weird that the gameplay designers chose to have Sigrika fight alongside us like Lupa did in 2.4, instead of allowing us to learn how to play her throughout the quest. When the game finally allowed me to try her out at the end of the quest, it was only for a single boss fight, so I felt a little cheated even though I enjoyed her moveset. Additionally, during these combat sections, I figured I could just AFK and let Sigrika and Chisa do all the work, which I'd count as a pretty big design flaw. Speaking of Chisa, it's funny that the writers put her in the quest just to silence players who criticize her lack of appearances in 3.0, since they removed her from the plot about 5 minutes later. This would continue to be an issue in the next patch.
I just like sitting around watching old movies.
Oh, there we go.
3.2 Segue features Lucilla and introduces Hiyuki. It reveals a bit of the Fractious plan and explores Lucilla's forte, her past, and her fears. Lucilla's forte revolves around memories that she can gain from resonating with certain items and delete them to free up her rather limited storage space. In other words, Lucilla is a living hard drive. Like Mornye, Lucilla's character arc happened in the past, which means this exploration is shorter than usual, giving more space for the Fractious plan to be explored. It is intriguing that the writers chose to feature Segue, not Hiyuki, as the second major character in this story. While Segue almost broke apart before making his decision to protect everyone else by banning all travel into the dark side, Lucilla willingly walks straight in and doesn't give a shit when the Fractious tries to break her. Her performance makes this story kind of fun, and it was a good decision to give her a belligerent attitude throughout. Hiyuki is portrayed here as a secret ally of Lucilla, and she is deliberately secretive, obviously hinting at her proper introduction in a later chapter. Also, her lack of reaction to Luuk's suspicious candy was interesting, as at the time there was a theory going around that Luuk was using the candy to uncover Fractious spies among the staff and students. Overall, this chapter is pretty good. .3's prologue focuses on Hiyuki, the banner character. As with 3.2's Segue, she primarily interacts with Lucilla. Hiyuki travels back to Honami City, presumably through the Black Shore's portal, and lays bare her regrets that stem from her failure to defend the city and its people. This section is slow-paced and serves as an important introduction to Hiyuki and her feelings towards her responsibilities. Later, the Grand Architect, who seems to love impersonating Nivora for whatever reason, shows Hiyuki a bunch of the rover's moments in a long hallway filled with looping videos. I find this strange because there was already a Hall of Memories moment for 2.x in 2.7 and another from the beginning in 3.1. Both were done pretty damn well through cutscenes, and this version is relatively inelegant because the developers chose to place looping videos instead of still images. Still, the presentation is fantastic, especially the Avenolium section. Either way, showing Hiyuki the rover's success in contrast with her failures plants a seed in her, though not the one that the Grand Architect intended. So this is important enough to warrant its own rather enjoyable short story. If I had to rate 3.3's main story, I'd probably say that it's just average due to two glaring issues. Firstly, this chapter is too short, and secondly, I think the Lahai-Roi arc could have benefited from a longer build-up before the climax. This main quest has a runtime of around 3 hours and does way too much within such a short time. Firstly, it introduces the Dimmer Plains without giving players much time to explore it in the story. Most of the quest uses the underground region with no time given to the snowy lands above. Then, it properly introduces Denia as the Threnodian's Resonator, giving her a nice interactive physics-based platforming section that is probably an evolution of Carlotta's Chandelier moment in 2.0, a goofy out-of-place Tetris minigame, and a full-on boss fight which caught me off guard due to how sudden it was at the time. Regardless of how rushed this part was, I enjoyed it quite a bit. Then, it introduces Chase, the head of the Space Track Collective, giving him plenty of screen time to flesh out the politics of the collective and the new Federation. Later, Aemeath sends out a set of coordinates that leads to our characters planning an operation to gather Royan runes all over the region. Unfortunately though, Chisa wasn't even given a single line of dialogue despite being present in a couple of lengthy scenes with the rest of the cast. It's like someone involved in the writing of the main story just doesn't like Chisa. Anyway, the operation is my favorite part of the main quest to play through because of its character interactions. Instead of just providing an objective marker as usual, the game also places Chisa, Lynae, and many NPCs around the region, allowing for plenty of optional dialogue. Unlike Chisa's abysmal resolution in 3.0, this is signposted pretty hard, so of course I went ahead and checked on every single team to compensate for missing out on plenty of interactions during the celebration in 3.2. I was surprised to see that a few NPCs featured in previous main and side quests taking part in the operation, with unique dialogue for all of them. Next, the game has the player do a few simple tasks before moving the characters around as they progress the operation. I also like that Lynae and Chisa had new dialogue the second time, though the same treatment wasn't given to the other NPCs. When the player returns to the Research Institute, many of these characters remain and small plot threads from the operation are followed up. For instance, I found 2 students fawning over Chisa during the operation, and when I returned to the Research Institute, they were talking to Chisa off to the side. Another example is Nastasia, who was injured during the operation, being taken care of by Nana in the Institute. However, I found that only a few playable characters could be interacted with here, which is a bit disappointing. Later, the rover recovers the Exostrider in void space and is teleported back to Startorch Academy for some reason. Here, he or she is told that a day had passed and that a logistically impossible evacuation of the entire region's population was carried out in that time. From there, the player is forced to teleport back to the Research Institute, though I opted to look around for a bit, noticing that under the beautiful purple foreboding atmosphere, the wildlife was all gone. However, more importantly, the highways didn't work anymore. So why teleport the player to the Academy instead of the Research Institute? After all, returning to the open world before doing the rest of the chapter reverts everything to its usual state, which breaks immersion. Fast forwarding to the final boss is fantastic in terms of presentation, but the mechanics are quite disappointing. The Exostrider doesn't have many moves for how long the fight takes, so I'm just pressing the same 3 buttons over and over again. Additionally, Aemeath, who I believe was still stuck in void space, was somehow able to teleport straight into the Exostrider to deliver the drive replica, which was still in the Research Institute. As far as I'm aware, this is never explained. As before, I think the void space journey should have been longer because going straight to the final boss fight and having Aemeath come to the rover instead of the other way around doesn't sit right. After the boss fight, there is a cutscene that shows a short time skip between the climax and the quiet ending of the chapter, which I find quite odd. I wish that instead of this time skip, there was a section where the player could drive back to Lahai-Roi and look at all the NPCs returning to the Beata Woods or the Academy in relief before the final scene. Also, this would have been a good moment to have the rover and Aemeath return as celebrities, instead of what we got in 3.0. Unfortunately, the evacuation of Lahai-Roi and its resettlements are not given any screen time, which is a shame. Even 3.0 had a cutscene before the Voidworm attack, but 3.3 had nothing. Also, the Grand Architect is still allowed to roam the Academy as Nivora even though his cover was blown by Luuk in 3.1's Segue. I'm just gonna say that this was an oversight. Now for my other big issue with this chapter. I believe the developers choosing to end the Lahai-Roi arc this early is a mistake because many things could have used more development or taken more time to complete. Although I enjoyed the search for the Royan runes, I think it was over way too quickly and should have taken much longer. As it is now, it seems to be more of a school excursion instead of a desperate operation to save the world. The construction of the reactor drive replica would have been a greater feat if it took longer, as in more patches to complete, and the same goes for rescuing Aemeath. As it stands now, the story went from introducing Lahai-Roi and the Space Track Collective New Federation political situation in 3.0 to introducing Aleph-1 and Aemeath, then losing her in 3.1, to taking part in the new solar celebration and investigating the dark side in 3.2, to establishing Denia as an enemy and quickly defeating her, then reuniting with Aemeath while defeating LF1, a supposed existential threat in 3.3. My guess is that earlier in development there was supposed to be something between 3.2 and 3.3 because this quick resolution is kind of sudden and reinforces my earlier impression of LF1 in 3.1. Regarding Hiyuki, the banner character, I like her scenes in the main quest. She plays her role well without taking up a bunch of screen time. Much like Galbrina, she is a supporting character introduced at the tail end of the region's main story, but unlike Galbrina, Kuro didn't shove her into the role of a secondary main character, which is an improvement from 2.x. But that just means the standards of this game's writing had plummeted during the Renacita arc. Additionally, I like how the prologue with the memory corridor influenced Hiyuki enough to allow for the conversations in the main quest where she asks the rover to reflect on his or her role and convictions. Whenever the rover reflects on his or her past or finds out something important, I keep asking, why can't we have this sooner? As if the writers are deliberately dragging out the rover's story as well as Abby's just because this is a live service game. Either way, the scenes between Hiyuki and the rover are my favorite part of the quest, in terms of dialogue. 3.3's epilogue features two major characters, Hiyuki and Aemeath. I greatly enjoyed this as well as most of the prologue. Unlike Augusta, Galbrina or Lynae, Hiyuki's backstory was kept out of the main story, allowing other characters and the main plot to shine. Instead of a companion quest though, Kuro chose to keep Hiyuki's backstory to the prologue and epilogue, which I find quite fitting if a bit odd. Were it not for Hiyuki's experience in the prologue feeding into her conversations with the rover in the main story, I think it would have been fine if she was given a companion quest instead. Either way, her story is written well, with her regrets and her sister as main focal points. As for Aemeath, it's a happy ending which I'm okay with. I enjoyed her intimate moments with the rover as she seems to be the only character who can draw out his or her feelings. However, I find it quite odd that other characters like teachers or students don't really comment on Aemeath's state throughout the story. For all they knew, she went into the cockpit, disappeared for 10 years, came back to tour the academy and host a concert, disappeared again, returned as an empty husk, then, after the Threnodian is defeated, she's fine again. As far as I know, no one seems surprised by this, which I find quite funny. Regardless, 3.3 has a nice peaceful resolution that I enjoyed.
Change the world. My final message. Goodbye.
Let's move on to Denia's companion quest. As a mandatory quest that takes place after Denia's defeat in 3.3, it focuses on her thoughts and actions during her supposed final moments. Upon starting the quest, it is made clear that Denia doesn't have much time to live, and that she is used as a political tool by both the Space Trek Collective and the New Federation, which, like Lynae in 3.0 and Aemeath in 3.1, makes Denia quite interesting right off the bat. After the rover visits her in the sick bay, he or she brings Denia on a tour of the academy. So far, Denia shows her appreciation for honesty, but the writers also hint at two things: Denia's tendency to fake her emotions and the different faces she wears, as evident from the complete change in tone from the voice actor.
余計なことにまで気を回して。わかりました。それじゃあ、約束ですからね。
The former would be confirmed when Denia revisits her home at the end of the quest, while the latter is made clearer throughout the various interactions. To better fit in with Startorch Academy students, Denia essentially has three faces: the serious face, which she only shows the rover, the innocent cute girl, which she uses to befriend others, and the asshole, which she sometimes uses to manipulate or influence others. This quest is basically a reused concept from a popular side quest in 3.0. This time it's just a playable character instead of a robot. Both are executed quite well. Yet again, this segue features good character usage, which points towards the company learning their lesson from 2.x. Sigrika and Denia's interactions are very important, as not only do they show Denia's concern for Sigrika, but it also shows Sigrika is way smarter than she lets on, evident from her guessing that Denia would die soon. Denia's regrets are also put on full display, which is on brand for a story surrounding a dying person. The greatest and most prominent is that Nastasia is no longer able to chase her dreams because of Denia herself. and Denia still not being able to say a proper goodbye. This is expanded upon by Denia's questions toward the rover and his or her lessons imparted to Denia herself. I like this segue way more than 3.3's main story, not because of Denia, but because the story doesn't rush anything, and because of the themes present here. Denia struggles with identity, emotion, and saying goodbye to her friends, which is relatable to a lot of people. Speaking of friends, I like how this quest brought back Sigrika and Nastasia, the NPC who got injured during the operation in 3.2. Just like how Denia and Nivora are bad influences on Sigrika, which greatly exacerbated her struggle with expectations in 3.2, Sigrika and Nastasia are a positive influence on Denia that reinforces her identity not as Aleph 1's resonator, but as a normal student. This, coupled with the rover's lesson and the removal of Cristoforo's script from her heart, influenced Denia to make a good decision at the end of the quest. Additionally, this quest shows a big contrast between Aemeath and Denia, as the former was raised by an overall benevolent godlike being in a cozy house, while the latter was raised by an Asian parent in an underground lab. Although both eventually did the right thing, because of course they do, their vastly different upbringings result in two very different situations. The brilliant and popular girl sacrificing herself to save the world, as opposed to the lonely girl struggling with emotions and schoolwork, making the decision to smash part of her home and retreat into void space. Something that really surprised me is that the writers understand the signs that someone fighting a terminal illness is about to die. I've read that when one's immune system gives up, all the energy is transferred back to the person, which results in a surge of energy before their death. Throughout the quest, Denia is full of energy, even being able to travel and use her powers on her own as if nothing was off. This could have also informed Sigrika. Like I said, she's way smarter than she looks. As for the presentation, this quest has a few cartoony moments that fit Denia and Sigrika rather well. Unlike, say, Hotel with Neverness to Everness, Kuro knows when to use them and when to abstain. On another note, I found something funny. Near the start of the quest, the developers had to teleport Denia in and out of the elevator because they couldn't make her enter and exit smoothly. Apparently, there is also a funny secret cutscene if the player jumps down instead of using the elevator, which is a nice inclusion. In complete contrast, this quest also has a lengthy horror section in Denia's old home, where the player is chased by weeping angels the entire time. I found this part to be a bit stressful, especially since I didn't know I could sprint, so I had to slowly walk the entire time. It reminds me of Cyberpunk 2077, which also had a random horror mission in the bad ending for the DLC. I think this is a refreshing way to spice up the gameplay and make this quest more memorable. Overall, I'd rate Denia's companion quest as pretty great.
Politics, how tiresome.
I kind of like 3.4's Segue despite its flaws. Let's go through the merits first. This story focuses on politics first and foremost, and the writers chose to show the true face of humanity as the story's antagonist. Whenever there isn't a unifying factor like the Thermodians or the TDs or the Fractidus to fight against, humanity quickly turns on itself, with the conflict surrounding the Synchronists being a prime example. Now that the main conflict is finished, the only story left to tell in Lahai-Roi is what happened to the people afterwards, and this seems like a fitting conflict. The Segue builds upon Lucilla's forte and makes use of level mechanics that are quite interesting but not exactly innovative. Assuming it uses the same structure as set pieces in 2.7, or Black Beacon's Library of Babel, or Titanfall 2's Effect and Cause, the way it works is by stacking similar levels on top of one another and teleporting the player between them. In Titanfall 2, for example, the vertical axis is used because it's the simplest, and it could be the same here. The only difference is that the player has to overlay Lucilla's photos on top of the background and in some cases adjust the focal length. As the player does this, they are teleported to the next level to continue the quest. Again, it's nothing new, but I must praise how the developers made this transition so invisible. At the end of the quest, the player goes through a set piece that teleports them multiple times. This one is unfortunately quite noticeable. On a side note, I like how both old and new characters are used here. Lynae, Sigrika, Chisa, and Aemeath play supporting roles and enhance every scene they are in, but the most surprising one is Alto, who provides input and fun moments throughout the quest. Lynae and Sigrika take a backseat as the story primarily focuses on the Synchronists and their struggle. The same goes for Chisa, though it is funny that this time she is the only one whose interaction isn't optional. My favorite character moments in this quest are from the students themselves as they try to cope with the looming shutdown of their entire course. Be it no longer paying attention in class to selling their hard work after several years of development, to trying to create new machines to convince the investors that they're still worth something, the students and the scenes that feature them sell the despair and desperation that surround such a circumstance. However, Lucilla's past students also show the hope that used to surround the program, one of which failed but took some junk back home, and another which piloted a spacecraft that got torn apart in mid-air. The first led to a counter for Retroact Rain in Jinzhou, and the latter eventually led to the creation of the Starward Riseway. In the ending of the story, Lucilla considers all these cases and presents hope as the primary reason as to why the Synchronists should be retained. This leads to her winning the argument against Camarel, which is an ending that is as predictable as it is visually beautiful. Unfortunately, the epilogue offers even more disappointment as it only provides a single conversation between Camarel and a nighttime scene with Lucilla. The most disappointing points to me are that the outcome of the hearing is shown in plain text of the worst variety, and that to my knowledge, the player cannot talk to the students or to Alto after the quest. As a Lynae enjoyer, I'm not exactly thrilled. Overall, this segue is good, but the poorly executed ending put a sour taste in my mouth. Regarding segues, I noticed by 3.3 that the developers made an interesting decision that took effect from 3.1. Some of them are focused more on plot, such as the one that introduces Hiyuki and the one with the weird looping videos. The others instead push the main plot aside to put the focus on one character. Basically, Kuro Games decided to keep companion quests as part of the main quest, but instead of shoving them down our throats like in 2.5 to 3.0, they decided to put these stories in between the main chapters and title them as segues, at least for Lahai-Roi. I think this is a rather elegant way of doing things because they build upon events that took place during the main story instead of interfering with them. The characters within also take the main story into account during their interactions, making everything a bit more connected. This decision reduces the number of pain points I've had with the main story for a long time, but the main story still suffers from glaring issues that Kuro would do well to remove in future chapters. With new story chapters come new complications and problems. Firstly, I'll address my disappointment with the premise regarding the rover and Star Torch Academy. Before 3.1, I had the reasonable impression that Kuro would give the rover a school arc where perhaps 1 or 2 chapters would focus on his or her journey in Star Torch Academy. If this were the case, the rover could have been affected by the dark side, leading to a slower build-up of the Fraxida's plan and a longer investigation. He or she could have also slowly befriended characters like Sigrika and Denia during his or her school life, making these relationships more organic. There could have been more time spent with Chisa, who could have befriended Lynae and Sigrika as she tries to adapt to new teaching methods and technologies at the academy. Additionally, the rover could have heard about Aemeath from teachers such as Voss who knew her before her disappearance. This could have directly led to 3.1's main story where Aemeath reveals herself to the rover. However, with the story already complete, there is no more room for development. In the epilogue, the rover announces that he or she is going to leave Lahai-Roi shortly after defeating LF1, which really sucks because the opportunity for an interesting school arc before or after the events of 3.3 was thrown away completely. This also means that the decision to make the rover a student of Star Torch Academy was pretty much pointless in the grand scheme of things. The 3 important things that came with being a student being the Star Torch uniform, the expedition motorbike, and access to academy facilities and the research institute could have all been granted by Lucilla anyway because the rover is part of the Black Shores and they are compelled to work together. Unfortunately, with the Lahai-Roi story, Kuro also introduced another thing that just doesn't fit together with earlier chapters. 2.6 introduced something called Chaos, which is just purgatory that is somehow part of the dark tide that the rover can somehow enter and use to rewrite Yuno into reality. Chaos is, to my knowledge, never brought up again. I believe it was 3.1 that introduced Void Space, a new dimension outside of time and space that is used to time travel and teleport as seen in both Aemeath and Denia. It also introduced void matter that can corrupt beings like Soliskin and damage human tissue and frequencies. As far as I remember, these aren't explained very clearly, and as far as I can tell, we are just supposed to take it at face value without thinking about how the Fractsidus can rewrite the entire story using void space, not to mention with Cristoforo's scripts as well. I highly doubt that void space or void matter would ever be brought up after this arc, or after 3.x, which may result in an extremely important alternate dimension being thrown away in the next arc just because it isn't relevant anymore, like Chisa, or Chaos, or Retroact Rain. Either way, I don't really like the way void space is implemented.
I don't like sand. It's coarse, rough, and irritating, and it gets everywhere.
Regarding environmental presentation, Lahai-Roi is stunning as usual. Startorch Academy, the Space Track Observatory, Beato Woods, and the rest of the underground region are breathtaking, with space exploration being a central theme. As such, the Academy looks like a planet from afar, the Research Institute is accessed by a rocket train, and the numerous rock faces are filled with inscriptions made by the region's indigenous astrologists. After rebuilding the observatory, players can also change the weather from anywhere, which is a much welcome feature that I had been waiting for since 1.0. Special mention needs to go to Startorch Academy, which heavily features motifs that emphasize the space exploration theme of the region. Scales, rotating rings, old-school sci-fi monitors, the rocket elevator, the heavy use of white, green, and gold, it's all there. The music and overall vibe also bring about a good amount of nostalgia and optimism, both of which come into mind when thinking about school and space exploration. As such, Startorch Academy is perfect for Lahai-Roi. Startorch Academy was expanded upon in 3.2 with the new solar celebration, giving it a very different vibe. The decorations are fitting and the solar skin balloons are adorable, but there is a lot more than that. Major characters and NPCs were given special interactions that were tied to the celebration atmosphere, and the best examples of these are in the Rebel College, which is where Chisa was first found in 3.0. The cute decorations, unique NPCs, students promoting their clubs or resting in the upper areas, all add to the mood that makes the new solar celebration feel very special. However, I have one small problem and one huge gripe with this whole thing. Let's start with the smaller one. It's disappointing that only a small part of the academy was changed in 3.2, as most of the place was left alone. Perhaps the developers didn't have enough time, or the celebration was only supposed to use a small part of the school. Either way, it's less immersive as a result. Now for the larger issue. Unlike Raguna's Carnivale atmosphere that had the decency to stay till 2.1 came around, the new solar celebration ends right after the player finishes the main quest, which is a huge downside as players are not allowed to find hidden interactions with playable characters or even look around a bit more without putting their story progression on hold. It probably didn't register to me in the moment, but ending the celebration means removing all the decorations and reverting the academy to its usual state. As such, I missed a bunch of secret interactions, but more importantly, I could not record the atmosphere for preservation and appreciation as I usually do, and I was very annoyed as a result. Luckily, I had a friend who agreed to lend me his account for a couple of days just for this purpose, so I only have him to thank for this opportunity. With something like Agla Town in Cantarella's companion quest, it was obvious that the atmosphere was part of the quest, so I recorded it during my playthrough. The new solar celebration, however, is tied to a main quest, and the only other example I can remember is the Carnivale, which remained after the quest was completed. I'm very disappointed that the developers chose to implement a celebration like this. The surface of the Royal Frostlands is less colorful than the underground section and even Mount Firmament, but it is far from boring or lifeless. There are many calm spots and silly moments with NPCs, and the region is dotted with hot springs and wildlife such as seals and penguins. As for enemies, those found in 1.x can also be found here, which is as fitting as can be for a band-aid solution to the region's low enemy variety. The region is also extremely vertical, which is a welcome change of pace as most regions in the game are quite flat. The underground spaces have way more color in them that contrasts with the rest of the place. A few particularly beautiful spots are the rover's old home, the Tree of Life, and the crashed space station. Speaking of the space station, I enjoyed exploring it in the main quest as it is large and fleshed out with multiple floors, which reminds me a bit of the puzzle room in Jinzhou City Hall. The color palette here is cold and the architecture is quite pretty, but I wonder how it is still powered on after it crashed onto the surface so many years ago. I also made a strange observation when exploring the region. Whenever the player rides the Jesus bike on water, there seems to be a circle around the bike where the water is completely flat, likely to make the ice under the bike not clip under the waves. This is especially noticeable when the player transitions from riding on land to riding on water, as the waves along the shoreline instantly disappear. This also applies to all water sources in the underground region, even the fountains in Star Torch Academy. It looks pretty funny here. Featured prominently in 3.2's main story, the dark side of the Academy features a primarily cold color palette with flashes of warmth in between. Similar to the Somme Noir, random props are used to create an unsettling atmosphere which fits the story well. As usual, I found myself pausing to take in the environment every now and then. A few notable highlights are the platforming section featuring musical instruments, and the cool skybox with the sun in the background, which is featured prominently throughout the main quest. The artists usually do a great job regarding the presentation of sonorospheres, and the dark side of the Academy is no different. Even though the Dimmer Plains was barely used in 3.3's main quest, its aesthetic was not sacrificed in favor of it. It features mostly purples and consists of a set of islands around the central great tree, the branches and leaves of which stretch so far out that they may as well be the region's skybox. If I had to compare it to something similar, it would be the Avenolium from 2.2 with its floating structures and overall layout. Like Fleur-de-Lis's central tower, the great tree in the Dimmer Plains serves as the main landmark that helps players orient themselves during exploration. The warm skybox and the purple used for most of the foliage create a soft, pleasant contrast. When completing a certain exploration quest with Sigrika, Aurora roads that span pretty much the entire region get added. As the exploration experience got gutted in favor of convenience, these roads only serve an aesthetic purpose in practice. Like most things in Wuthering Waves, the Aurora roads look pretty damn good, but I wish more was done in terms of substance and interactivity.
I'm escaping to the one place that hasn't been corrupted by capitalism. Space!
As I stated in my 3.0 video, the first region of Lahai-Roi had a great exploration experience featuring the motorcycle, which has its own unique abilities. The underground region ties player progression with convenience, balancing the bike's limited stamina with a highway that doesn't use stamina. The player can rebuild the highway while completing other content, giving them progressively more convenience. The other tools placed around the map allow the player to unlock more methods of travel aside from fast travel points, making exploration enjoyable, rewarding, and varied. The region is also full of solar skins and hot springs for the player to find. Although I'm disappointed by the chests being marked on the map again, at least they allowed instant collection from afar, which I sometimes ignore in favor of using my own eyes. Additionally, the player can automatically drive on the highways with a cinematic view and an optional companion. This is just for sightseeing and holds little gameplay importance because utilization of region mechanics and resonance beacons are more effective. The player is also given a radio that can play all soundtracks collected through exploration, but this is only available on the bike. I believe that the underground region has the best exploration experience out of all the regions introduced from 3.0 to 3.4. With 3.0, the developers set a high bar for future updates and regions. For my full thoughts on this matter, do watch my 3.0 video. 3.1 has players journey to the surface of the Royal Frostlands, which features a small but more vertical map. The first and most prominent addition to the experience is a motorcycle mod which I call the Jesus Bike. It essentially allows the player to drive on water, albeit much slower. It's acceptable as all it does is allow the player to explore the entire map without needing to swim. This update also adds spirit springs taken straight from Elden Ring. These help with the vertical aspect of travel and are pretty much required for this kind of map. The player can unlock them by shooting them from the bike. The only thing I dislike about them is that the player jumps up a bit too quickly, which can feel sudden, and that there are a bit too many of them. Also, thanks to how tall some of these cliffs are, even these can be insufficient. This region also features a 1.0 exploration tool, vertical wind tunnels that lift the player up when using the glider. They are very helpful when navigating between platforms of differing heights, and they have more practical use here than in Huanglong. I didn't expect this to make a return, so it came as a nice surprise. The puzzles in the Royal Frostlands built upon those found in 3.0. One such example is this fun bike challenge, which is more difficult than the ones from 3.0, and which I tried repeatedly to solve, but bad UX caused an accidental pity completion. Another type of puzzle features the adorable Soulskins and are heavily inspired by Poly Bridge. They simply require the player to guide the Soulskins on the left to the Elder on the right with rewards on completion. I quite like them as they aren't as simple as most others tend to be. Overall, 3.1's exploration is less impressive than 3.0's, but that doesn't mean it's bad in any way. It's still enjoyable and of high quality. 3.3 introduced the Denia Plains, which are essentially a collection of floating islands. As a result, navigation is more difficult compared to the underground area or the Frostlands. To compensate, and possibly to cater to players who complained about the lack of flight in 3.0, the designers decided to reintroduce flight in a different way. The motorbike was given a new glide ability that can be activated at any time. The resulting super jump that can be done multiple times before landing kind of trivializes the verticality aspect of this region as well as the Royal Frostlands. This, combined with the glide ability, further trivializes the distance aspect of the Denia Plains. Even though exploration in 3.3 is reminiscent of 2.x, that does not mean the Denia Plains lacks its own interesting design aspects. The developers built upon what was present in earlier regions while introducing new ideas like light builder puzzles that grant access to cozy little rooms that contain Soulskins, a penguin, a hidden classroom, or even an arcade cabinet that contains its own minigame. The region includes mid-air grapple points and Elden Ring Spirit Springs, which were both made obsolete thanks to the new glide ability. When I came across these objects, I quickly theorized that the ability to super jump and glide was added to the bike way after the region was already designed, and I criticized the open world designers for not committing to their design decisions and caving to criticism from players who just couldn't let go of the flight tool from 2.x, and from what I've heard, there were plenty of these players. However, unpopular decisions do not necessarily equate to unhealthy ones regarding the game's longevity. In fact, the removal of 2.x's flight tool in 3.0 was a bold decision that made Lahai-Roi stand out in terms of exploration and traversal. 3.1 built upon this by requiring the player to interact even more with the mechanics to overcome the vertical design of the region. 3.3 did the opposite by reducing interaction to a minimum, not only for the Denia Plains but also for the previous regions. This, for me, made it less fun to explore, and I opted not to use the glide tool when I could. Even then, I took way less time to complete my exploration targets compared to 3.0 and 3.1. As a result of its boring exploration experience and less screen time in the main story, the Denia Plains is much less memorable compared to the Frostlands or the underground region.
Sing we now, sing for the year, sing for the laughter, sing for the tear.
As is tradition for Wuthering Waves, the exploration and side quests far outweigh the main quest in terms of writing quality and sometimes gameplay variety. It's been like this since 1.0, and although 3.x has the main quest improved in terms of writing, the side quests still have an overall advantage. 3.0 starts off with a very strong first impression. Most of the exploration quests in the underground region are quite memorable. The first has the player construct the highway that spans the region. Aside from being reminiscent of Death Stranding, this quest is meant to be done in the background while other quests and exploration milestones are being completed. Even when the highway isn't finished, it helps the player by making traversal much smoother overall, and of course, this is enhanced when all the sections are fully built. The second quest is a more traditional one where the player follows a linear story that ends with a full reconstruction of the Space Trek Observatory. It features an adorable NPC and unlocks an aesthetic feature which I had been asking for since 1.0, the ability to change the weather at will. The third quest focuses on the mystical aspect of the Beato Woods and has the player travel between Soulless trees and collect a flock of adorable Soulskins, which is used to interact with the level and solve puzzles. Finally, it ends with a nice rhythmic platforming section. This quest stands out for its Soulskins and its unique mechanics, but the writers also threw in a thought-provoking question at the end. The Dimmer Plains introduced quite a few exploration quests too, and there are two that I enjoyed. The first is called Broken Dimmer Heart, which mostly follows Lynae, the cute tomboy Synchronist who didn't receive dynamic expressions till 3.4. This quest heavily features a simple environmental mechanic and interactive objects as it tasks the player with clearing out what is essentially poisoned swamps in various locations to progress. Throughout the quest, Lynae seeks to restore an old reactor drive prototype with the help of a bunch of Soulskins facing pushback from Mornye due to her risky approach. Lynae's unique appearance, bold attitude, and ties to Professor Warren makes her interesting on her own, and Mornye's back and forth with Lynae prevents this quest from being just a simple adventure. Also, the quest includes Lucilla and Professor Anselm from 3.0. Or was it Anselm? Either way, this quest does a good job of providing some gameplay variety, introducing or fleshing out characters, and planting seeds for 3.4's Segue, which is more than what most of these quests offer outside of their self-contained stories. The second is A Perfect Day for Flying, which prominently features Sigrika. At certain moments, the player is required to control a cute Soulskin to progress, which is a nice callback to the Clang Bang puzzles from 1.1's Mount Firmament. This quest is similar to one from 3.1 because it also features a Chrono Claw that leads the player to the set pieces. In this case, it's a snowy floating island that is completely different to the rest of the Dimmer Plains. At the end, the rover and Sigrika get a scenic fly-through of the region on the back of the Chrono Claw, and the player gets access to new roads that span the region, potentially helping with exploration. However, due to the inclusion of the new glider and super jump in 3.3 as well as the fact that these roads don't regenerate stamina while driving on them, they practically become simple background props that just make the region look better. Finally, 3.3 presents an evolution of 3.0's highway reconstruction project. After the main quest, the Space Trek Collective undertakes a big expedition into the Dimmer Plains with Iris as a supporting character. There is plenty of NPC and Exoswarm activity here, which helps liven up the whole expedition vibe. As for mechanics, the player has to clean up the place much like in Broken Dimmer Heart, and do a few other tasks to collect resources that have to be given to Iris to level up the base camp. Each level adds buildings and NPCs to the region. Compared to the highway, this took me far less time as there is just less content in the Dimmer Plains. Although most of these quests are quite memorable, some were given a bit less effort. 3.0 had one that asks the player to free jet rays through song using Soulskins as the medium. The main NPC featured here isn't remarkable and the story is kind of forgettable, but the reward is quite nice. Finishing this quest unlocks a long special cutscene with Lynae and adds these jet rays to the open world. The Chrono Claw quest in 3.1 was disappointing in terms of length and story. Much like the Twin Dragons quest in 2.4, the story mainly focused on an unremarkable NPC and creatures of some sort and doesn't really amount to much. The main highlight for both is the environmental change that occurs upon completion, which I'd say is a bit underwhelming, at least in this case. As for side quests, 3.0 doesn't disappoint. The region comes with quite a few, including a string of quests centered around supernatural elements, a quest that ties into the Soulskin's lore, and another that lights up one of the many rock faces in the region. One of the more memorable ones in 3.0 was the one with Robbie, the failing robot that asks the player to help complete its bucket list. This has the player visit a few nice locations in Lahai-Roi before sending it off with what I believe is an intentional reference. If I'm not wrong, this quest is unlocked right after completing the underwater section of the highway, which is also used in a side quest that features Mornye. 3.1's photo-taking quest is underlined with a rather sad story which caught me by surprise as these quests usually don't stray far from their relaxing, lighthearted tone. It does end on a good note though, which is about as well as it could have been. On the other hand, we have Fracture the Frozen Mirror, which goes on for too long. When following the story, the player is told to drive on these set virtual tracks over and over again, which gets old quickly. Another quest that suffers from poor gameplay is Etched in the Heart. While its story is alright, the quest throws huge walls of text and brain-dead puzzles at the player. The latter is more annoying to me as Abby automatically provides solutions that are completely unnecessary due to the lack of difficulty. Overall, the best side quests in my opinion were in 3.0, with the quality going down in 3.1 and 3.3. Fortunately, they were overshadowed by the more memorable exploration quests that carried these regions, so I'm willing to let it slide a bit. I'd say Lahai-Roi's events are pretty good overall. Although 3.0 and 3.1 had a mostly lackluster list, 3.2 and 3.3 picked up the slack and provided players with memorable and enjoyable events. Let's go over the bad ones first. 3.0 saw the return of 2.4's Peaks of Prestige, which is as odd as it is unnecessary. I'm not sure why it was brought back because it fits the competitive warrior vibe of Septimons but is completely at odds with the atmosphere of Star Torch Academy. Unfortunately, it's just the same card game with a few new mechanics, but at least we know that some Star Torch professors are pretty cool with games like this. I've not finished this event as of now, and I'll probably forget about it as often as I do Tower of Adversity or Wuthering Waves. My thoughts on 3.1's events is rather mixed. There were a few that were quite good and some that should have been cut in favor of reallocating developer resources. The Exoswarm herding minigame is way too short, and the one that mocks those fake annoying mobile ads went on for too long. While it does require some player input in the harder levels, the first half of the event can be done without any inputs at all. There were simply too many levels, and for some reason the one labeled endless isn't endless at all. To balance all that out, 3.1 came with an excellent event that already had its environments featured on this channel. The Forever Fest is quite similar to 1.2's Moon Chasing Festival, in that both are a party that features character interactions, a level up system, and their own short stories. Forever Fest heavily features two characters, Lumi, who still has no main story relevance, and Cop Kopo, a brand new character. All the content in this event is voice acted, which is a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. Regarding gameplay, this event has a lot to offer. Early on, the player is introduced to a card game through Jinsey, and they can face two more characters after that. The same goes for the bartender minigame, which reminds me of Valhalla. Figuring out a character's favorite drink can be difficult, especially for Carthusia, but doing so unlocks more dialogue. In addition, the player can decorate the entire place with a bunch of props. The player's weapons, echoes, and even motorcycle are featured prominently in their dedicated spots, making the place livelier with each decoration. It had been speculated in 2.8 that the cafe decoration was supposed to be like this, and it's great that the developers managed to add this into the game, if only briefly. Even though they probably just dumped all their props and said, "have fun," it feels like a show of appreciation. To top it all off, the player can change the skybox, which follows the observatory function introduced in 3.0. This event heavily features characters from 1.x, 2.x, and 3.x, and although I would have preferred if they interacted more with each other, I'm glad that the developers didn't entirely forget about them, though I wish this was also applied to the main story. Overall, Forever Fest is an enjoyable event which also turns out to be very disappointing. This is because it is not a permanent event. This has more content compared to some permanent events like 2.0's Tales of the Isles or 2.4's Peaks of Prestige, which makes Kuro's decision to have it be a limited event come off as strange. This also calls back to 1.2's Moon Chasing Festival, which suffered the same fate, but thankfully, Forever Fest doesn't have any main story content. Speaking of celebration atmospheres, let's move on to 3.2's new Solar Celebration. As stated earlier, this is tied into the main story, and both the event and main story are negatively affected because of this decision. The new Solar Celebration features 26 levels split between 6 Lahai-Roi playable characters, with 5 sections for Lynae, Mornye, Sigrika, Luuk, and Lucilla, and 1 for Aemeath's Husk. Each character takes the rover onto a small side quest of their own. Lynae, Mornye, Sigrika, and Luuk's sections fit the light-hearted atmosphere of the new Solar Celebration, while Lucilla's and Aemeath's sections are the opposite. I find Lucilla's section particularly interesting as it provoked a few questions within me. Plus, the principal helping out the student struggling with her memories kind of fits in with her own struggles, which was revealed in the Segue. Overall, I like this event as it adds quite a bit to the new Solar Celebration, which is the main overarching event in 3.2. Unfortunately, the event also had plenty of go here kill this or go here pick up this resource objectives that essentially come off as further padding, on top of the event itself already padding out the short main quest. This put a sour taste in my mouth, and if these objectives were removed, nothing would have been lost. In addition to the tie-in events, 3.2 featured a few others. The arcade games like the Fuel Instrumentality Project and the Tetris-like Lahai-Roi blocks provide about a half hour of relaxing fun and don't overstay their welcome. The same goes with Knights of the Wild, a combat event that carried on the ideas that were first present in 2.4's Banners Never Fall. The more prominent rhythm game that accompanies them clearly took more effort, as not only is there much more content, but there are fun scenes with characters tied into it. In fact, these conversations, coupled with others from 3.2's main quest, convinced me to finally obtain Lynae due to her performance and energy, which I've praised quite a lot since 3.0. Now, I do not play rhythm games, so I'm not qualified to speak on its quality, but I do have two complaints. In certain sections, the player's plane will speed up or roll 120 degrees, making it quite disorienting. Additionally, the two colored nodes are way too similar in terms of color and shape, making them difficult to tell apart in fast-paced sections. These two sources of frustration kind of bring it down for me, but it's not a deal breaker. With the final main chapter of Lahai-Roi came the long-awaited and much beloved depths of Elusive Realm, which hadn't been a thing since 1.x. I still remember enjoying it when the game first came out, and entering the Somme Noir again felt like a trip down memory lane. 3.3's version mostly kept the core mechanics the same, in which the player chooses an echo at the beginning of a run and levels it up through upgrades which also buff their characters. As before, the player's chosen echo plays a big role in combat engagements, which is cool because echoes are usually only relegated to providing buffs or dealing small amounts of damage. Unlike the old version, the new one allows players to pick from a larger selection of echoes and choose two other characters to assist in combat using their supers, or to have Namipon attack the enemy on certain occasions, greatly increasing their freedom of choice. As before, weird builds like DPS Baichu and Phase Tank Camellia can thrive under these conditions, and the Crownless Echo allows players to attack the enemy while receiving no damage while the echo is active. As such, this stayed as my favorite echo, even with the new additions. The environments also changed to include newer regions and arenas. While the original had a dreamy aesthetic with its pink grass and floating props, this one features the dark side of the Academy and Honami City as primary locations. Shasho Cafe, Sigrika's introduction arena, and Imperator's Renacita simulation stand out as notable examples of locations that were reused pretty well. If any environments deserve to be part of the Somme Noir, it'd definitely be the dark side and Honami City. 3.4 added a new challenge after the main content, a series of 5 bosses that adds debuffs on the player with each boss defeated. These bosses can be challenged in any order, which is nice, but what is really interesting to me is that the player's build can be saved at the end of a run and used in this challenge. I managed to easily clear the first 4, but the final challenge got the better of me thanks to the modifier constantly draining my HP. The Depths of Elusive Realm is one of the most popular game modes in Wuthering Waves, and I'm glad that Kuro decided to have it return in 3.3 and 3.4. Unfortunately, as of the making of this video, they have not committed to making it a permanent game mode. I hope that will change in the future. 3.x had Kuro collab with a whole bunch of franchises such as Sonic, Persona, Resident Evil, and Angry Birds for some reason. These were usually limited to customization options for the motorbike and pretty much nothing else. Thankfully, these skins were free, unlike the special bike skins which cost about $25 each. 3.4 included the long-awaited collab with Cyberpunk Edgerunners, which is frankly amazing. It has plenty of references to Edgerunners and 2077, and it is very faithful to the source material. Most importantly, it features a great story that spoils the show for some reason, as well as 2 playable characters, one of which is a free login reward. I have plenty more to say regarding this collab, so I'll put them in its own dedicated video. Let's move on to the next part. The second anniversary of Wuthering Waves is, how do I put this politely, pretty damn underwhelming. As expected, there are free pulls and a special bike skin which I like quite a bit, but in terms of events it's disappointing overall. Ever since the first anniversary, I'd been hoping for the return of Cube, Cubic, and QB because it was a pretty fun, adorable event. Unfortunately, the developers chose to carry over QB Derby instead for the second anniversary. As before, it's a simple racing event that asks players to vote for their favorite cubes and hope that they win. There's nothing much else here in terms of interactivity, so the only thing left is my disappointment at how the developers created new cube versions of 2.x and 3.x characters but only featured them in this small limited time event. The art is very cute though. Fortunately, the second anniversary had its own gameplay event. Star bouncing bears some resemblance to Cube, Cubic, and QB in terms of levels and upgrades, but instead of cubes that players control directly, this one turns its characters into paintballs. The level of interactivity goes down as expected, and unfortunately the level design also disappoints. Much like its first anniversary counterpart, star bouncing goes on for a bit too long and the difficulty spikes only at the end, which is quite jarring. Also, it lacks a celebratory story that gave the Cube event a fitting mood. Overall, star bouncing is fun for a while, but it's a bit disappointing. Just like last time, the second anniversary has its own little shop. Bountiful Waves is just another version of Blazing Night Market, and unfortunately, the same mistakes are present in both. Essentially, the most desirable rewards are paywalled as players cannot earn enough resources to purchase them without pulling for characters or weapons. This time, it's Denia's doll and the adorable Hiyuki cube. Finally, we have the recap of the player's stats during the previous year, but the GUI is a lot less charming than the first, which featured a lot more variation in artwork. This could be due to the Cyberpunk collab and perhaps 3.5 taking priority, but since Kuro Games is now a really big company, I'm not going to excuse this. The most important combat addition in 3.x is Tune Break, a new universal mechanic that functions alongside the vibration meter. Upon filling up a new circular gauge, the player can force an affected enemy into a long stun animation on top of dealing physical damage. This new gauge was added to older enemies as well, making them easier to kill. However, new enemies were designed and balanced around it, which resulted in a worrying amount of HP inflation, more frequent attacks, and most importantly, much more mobility and airborne time, making Lahai-Roi's elite enemies comparable to some Renacita bosses. This has made them more annoying to deal with in general, even if HP and damage values were not accounted for. Regarding enemies from earlier regions, their HP and vibration values were not tuned to accommodate this new mechanic. In other words, enemies that were not designed with Tune Break in mind die too quickly now. As a result, the balance of earlier regions has been shifted too much to the player's advantage. Back in 3.0, I had a wait-and-see attitude towards Tune Break because the fact that players can choose when to force the enemy into a long stun animation is a cool interaction that allows for more skill expression. In hindsight, I'm less optimistic. This new mechanic is very strong, which means that the cost ended up being quite high. Overall, I think Tune Break should have been only an interruption tool that deals little damage, and the enemy's HP values should have been kept in line with Renacita's to compensate. As for character-specific additions, 3.x introduces and innovates on a few with some of its new characters. For instance, some of Lynae's attacks require the jump button, which was first implemented in Yuno's moveset. This makes the inputs more varied than, say, Tyrion or Mornye that rely too much on holding down the basic attack button. Sigrika's forte gauge can be filled with either yellow or green parts, and her special moves depends on the player's choice. Hiyuki's special moves make use of a held stance that unlock a new list of moves including sword waves and the heavy attacks ideally used for parrying. However, the strongest moves are the light attacks that are used to build up to the final blow. Lucilla's forte gauge requires the player to hold down the attack button and release it based on alignment, playing into the timing aspect instead of varied inputs. This is reminiscent of Sanhwa's special attack in 1.0. That's about as much as I can recall since I only bothered to obtain Mornye and Lynae, so if there are any that I missed, do let me know. When it comes to boss mechanics, only two really stand out to me as interesting enough to warrant mentioning, as far as I can remember anyway. The first is from the Reactor Husk, a reskin of the Monteli's Sentry construct. Its most interesting attacks take the form of claw projectiles that can be reflected. The second is Hyvatia, which has an attack that records the player's action and repeats the same attack. If the player dodges it the first time, they must parry the second hit and vice versa. Repeating the same method on the second hit will not work. Although it takes a while to get used to, this is a good way to force players to interact with enemy attacks in ways other than just dodging everything. As you could probably guess, I haven't fought most of the bosses other than in the story because I don't need to farm their materials. So if one of the other bosses have unique and or interesting mechanics that I am not aware of or forgot about, do let me know. With version 3.0 came the WavesLine app, which is a simple in-game messaging app that is meant to increase character interactions outside of main and side quests. In theory, it could have added a lot for players who care a lot about these characters, but Kuro chose to heavily limit these interactions by tying them to quests or exploration progress. In addition, when I first used this function in 3.0, I was met with messages from 1.x and 2.x characters addressing the rover as if I had just finished their quests, which was funny because many of these quests had been completed over a year ago. The WavesLine app was used heavily in main and side quests and act as a way for NPCs to direct the rover without physically moving around. It can work well in some cases, such as when the distance between objectives is too large, and when used sparingly alongside physical interactions, it can work quite well, as evident from 3.3's main quest. However, my overall opinion on WavesLine is negative. My main criticism, as stated in my 3.0 review, is that the app was used as a low-cost, low-effort excuse to exclude characters from story involvement without making it look obvious, or to simply replace physical interactions altogether. For example, there were a few phone conversations with Chisa, one of which revealed that she had befriended Lynae off-screen. Lucilla also used WavesLine to introduce Hiyuki to the rover instead of doing it in person, which is another missed opportunity. As a result of its impersonal nature, some of these character interactions aren't satisfying or meaningful because the player can't see the participants or their reactions. When Neverness to Everness came out, I tried it out and was a little impressed with its implementation of such a feature. Players can receive messages from multiple characters during and after quests, making character interactions more believable. Players can also request to meet playable characters, which helped increase immersion. Whenever I used NTE's equivalent to WavesLine, I was constantly thinking about Wuthering Waves and how it could also benefit from something like this. As it stands now, it's only relevant to whichever quest the player is doing, and characters never text the rover at any point outside of these quests, leaving plenty of chats with nothing but old messages. 1.x and 2.x characters were also retroactively included, which makes no sense because there is nothing to suggest that they used it in the past. Overall, I see WavesLine as a failure and a terribly implemented idea that could have been so much more.
God damn, Jimmy, this some serious gourmet shit.
Kuro made quite a few quality of life improvements with Lahai-Roi. Now there's no way I can remember all of them, so I'll only mention the ones that I think are the most impactful. Starting with 2.8, Kuro introduced a nice way for players to keep up with upcoming updates using a kind of news tab. Most relevant information regarding the next version would be there, which keeps players who don't venture outside of the game in the loop. It can also help players plan for future activities like which echoes to farm or which characters to get. From 3.0 to 3.4, the developers introduced stuff like the ability to instantly convert materials when upgrading a character's skills, as well as a new echo management tab. While earlier updates allowed players to automatically lock and discard echoes, the new one allows players to do so with much more flexibility and efficiency. I've nothing much else to say here. These are great features that I think should have been added way earlier, but it's good that they are here now. Version 3.1 gave players what they've wanted ever since the game released: the ability to re-roll the substats on their echoes through an item called the transducer. However, it's terrible in execution for 3 reasons. Players cannot choose which substats they get. The more substats that the player locks, the more transducers are required to re-roll a single echo once, and each transducer costs the equivalent of 5 modifiers. Modifiers can only be spent on echoes that have not been upgraded and are only spent one at a time. Transducers have no such limitations but are far more expensive and thus far more limited. What makes this worse is that the resource used to obtain transducers can only be obtained by pulling for characters or weapons. As I see it, this is a case of malicious compliance. You may reroll the substats on your echoes, so you technically get what you want, but we're going to make it as miserable as possible so you still have to waste time farming and rolling for substats because transducers are never worth the trouble. I've only ever used it once, and that's only because I had to collect this footage as an example. It seems that every new region starting from Septimont comes packaged with a ton of cool upgrades to presentation and small environmental interactions, as well as a bunch of bugs. Lahai-Roi is no exception. I've been saying this a lot on my streams and videos, but Kuro needs to seriously stop releasing content for a while and fix what's already there, on top of lowering the file size of the game. Now let's move on to bugs. 3.0 came with quite a lot, but I'll only show what I encountered as usual. I spotted a few issues regarding draw groups and shadows in different parts of the world. The Beata Woods suffers from a loading issue which allows players to see the area loading and deloading when entering and exiting respectively. When traveling, motion blur would periodically return to my game, forcing me to go into the settings and turn it on and off to fix it. The worst of it came when I tried to fast travel once, and the game constantly denied my request, only to teleport me under the map after about half a minute. I saw fewer bugs in the later versions, and the ones that I did see were more on the funny or unpolished side as opposed to game-breaking and/or performance issues. For example, there were faulty map icons, snapping animations, camera issues, and developer text that wasn't replaced in the live build. All this is on top of the massive issues that others have been reporting at the time, including huge frame drops in busier areas like Startorch Academy. Again, I'm one of the least qualified to complain about poor optimization because my PC is powerful, but still I want to because it's a problem for a sizable portion of the player base. And with that, I end the video. There it is, everything I have to say about the game from 3.0 to... Well, I originally intended to end at 3.3, but 3.4 continued the Lahai-Roi story, so from 3.0 to 3.4, minus the Cyberpunk Edgerunners collab, which will get its own video. Wow, this took a very long time to make. Employment's a bitch, you know. Anyway, I suppose Lahai-Roi kinda made me like Wuthering Waves a bit more compared to Renacita. I'm still mixed on the main story, but most other things are improving quite a lot, so I guess I'll stick around for now. That's it for this video, thanks for watching.